The alarm on my salvage rig was not supposed to go off. I had the scanner tuned specifically to ignore debris, cooling wreckage, dead ships, anything that had already finished the business of being alive. It went off anyway, screaming like a thing possessed, and I rolled out of my bunk and hit the console before I was even half awake, still reaching for the silence button when my eyes found the screen and my hand stopped cold. One thermal signature, large, still generating heat. I stood there in my socks on the cold deck plate and stared at it for a full 10 seconds. The display gave me distance, mass estimate, energy output, and all of those numbers were pointing at the same conclusion. Something was still trying to survive out there in the long stretch of dark between the Karath Dominion's outer boundary and the absolutely nothing that came after it. For 3 days I had been working the debris field left behind by a battle I had no part in. A Karath military fleet and whatever they had been fighting had taken each other apart somewhere in this stretch of unmaintained space, and the debris ellipse they had left behind ran for 40-odd thousand kilometers in every direction from the center point. Salvagers call this region the shopping district, because after a conflict out here the pickings are genuinely good if you know what you are looking at, and you do not mind the particular smell of recent violence. I knew what I was looking at, and I had learned long ago not to mind the smell. I had been working the edges for 3 days, collecting copper wire coils and cracked hull plating, and 3 intact power coupling housings that I had found in the forward section of something that used to be large. All of it was destined for Waypoint 11, where I knew buyers for each category, and had already mentally spent the income on the Harriet's next maintenance cycle. That was the work. That was the life. I had chosen it, and I had built it, and on most days it suited me very well. But the thermal signature was not debris. It was not a ship running through the final stages of cooling. It was actively generating heat, drawing from a power source, putting out the specific energy signature of a life support system working hard. My scanner's biological function updated 30 seconds after the thermal alert. 1 life sign, declining. I have been working salvage independently for 7 years. I have found a great many things in debris fields. I have never found exactly 1 life sign. You find none, which is by far the most common answer, or you find many, which happens in the first hours after a battle, while there are still survivors in escape pods and survival suits. 1 is the count you get when something went profoundly wrong, and was survived by precisely the wrong number of people. The estimate at the bottom of the screen was not comfortable reading. Thermal envelope failure in approximately 8 hours, possibly less if the hull seals were compromised. 8 hours before whatever was still alive in there would stop being alive. I looked at the life sign. I looked at the timer. I ran the math on turning around, which took about 15 seconds, and came out the same way math comes out, regardless of what you want it to say. My name is Mara Voss. I am 29 years old. I have been fixing things that other people gave up on since I was old enough to hold a tool, starting in my grandmother's repair shed on a cold English coast where the fishing boats came in broken and needed to leave whole before morning, because otherwise the catch did not happen, and the family did not eat. I learned from her that the first question about a broken thing is never whether it can be fixed. The first question is what it will take. Then you look at what you have, you measure the gap, and you start filling it. I sat down at the navigation console and set a new course. The Harriet is the ship I have been working from for 7 years. I found her in a scrap lot at Waypoint 6 when I was 22. So completely stripped that the lot owner had stopped trying to sell her and was charging a daily parking fee to whoever wanted her gone. I paid for her with 4 years of income from other people's salvage crews. I spent the following 2 years turning her back into something that flew. She is not beautiful and she is not fast. Her hull has been patched in 17 places. Her secondary fuel regulator has been running 3 degrees warm for the past 2 days, and I have been meaning to look at it. Her idle has a slight irregularity that I know the cause of and have chosen to leave alone because fixing it would require pulling the main drive manifold, and the irregularity is not actually causing a problem. She is mine in the specific complete way that things are yours when you build them from pieces with your own hands. She came around at my input and aimed herself toward the thermal signature, and I watched the scanner as the distance closed. The details resolved at about 400 kilometers. Karath hull alloy, identified by the scanner's modified mineral reader, which I had reconfigured 18 months ago specifically to distinguish Karath construction materials from standard Union grades. Then the silhouette came together, Flagship class. The largest military category in the Karath inventory. A ship designed to anchor a battle group and carry enough crew and firepower to hold a contested system alone. Or it had been that. Now the starboard spine was cracked open from midship to stern, the atmosphere venting in slow rotating clouds that caught the far light and made the whole wreck look like it was releasing its last breath. The hull was the deep red-black of Karath military vessels. And on the prow, still visible through severe structural damage, was the Royal Standard. I stopped the Harriet's approach and sat with that for a moment. The Karath Dominion and humanity had been conducting 60 years of careful non-relationship. We found each other unpredictable. They found us persistent. What had emerged from 6 decades of cautious mutual avoidance was something close to an arrangement, an informal understanding that neither side would push too hard on the lines the other had drawn. It had worked because both sides had, on the whole, honored it. The Royal Standard was not a normal line to be found on the wrong side of. Karath royalty was military, and spiritual, and biological, all woven together into a concept that I understood only partially, but understood well enough to know that this ship, this specific wreck, was a different category of situation from anything in my 7 years of experience. I could have turned around. I assessed that option with the same thoroughness I applied to any other option. File a discovery report through Union Salvage Authority channels, let the appropriate parties handle it, keep my hands clean and my involvement minimal, and my life uncomplicated. The math on that option was clear. The scanner updated. 1 life sign. Still declining. I brought the Harriet in. Docking manually with a wrecked ship requires a sequence of small, precise decisions made under time pressure, with equipment designed for different circumstances. The flagship's standard docking systems were offline. I found a section of intact hull near an emergency airlock, extended the Harriet's secondary clamp arms, and pressed my ship's outer hatch against the Karath hull at the specific pressure and angle that would form a temporary seal. I have done this before. Not with a ship of this scale or this significance. The physics do not change based on what the ship means. I suited up in my work suit, which is canvas with reinforced joints, and a helmet, whose faceplate I repaired 18 months ago with 2-part structural epoxy. The epoxy holds. I have tested it in controlled depressurization 3 times. That is enough. My tool bag weighed 12 kilograms when I shouldered it. The multi-scanner, modified 3 times from its factory configuration to read materials it was never designed to read. The manual drivers and splice tools collected from estate sales and scrap bins over 7 years, each one worn familiar by use. The conductive bonding tape, the 2 fast-set structural foam canisters, the 6 hull clamps in 3 sizes, the portable arc welder on its power cell, and at the bottom, wrapped in a square of cloth, because its original casing had cracked in a fall 7 years ago, and I had never replaced it, my grandmother's marine wrench. Heavy steel, old marine design, not built for space work but useful for the angles that nothing built for space work could reach. I had carried it since the year I found the Harriet. I checked the hatch seal, checked it again, opened it. The Karath emergency airlock controls were designed for 3-fingered hands wider than mine. 4 minutes of careful work with a flat pry bar engaged the manual release. When the inner door opened, the Karath atmosphere came through, heavier than standard, dense with nitrogen, smelling of iron and something herbal that I had no reference for. My suit filtered it down to something workable. Inside, emergency lighting, red panels at floor level, everything in shadows and uncertain distances. I moved at the speed the damaged space allowed, and let the scanner do the spatial work my eyes could not do reliably in that light. The life sign was pulling me deeper into the ship, through a doorway that had lost its door, around a section of collapsed ceiling caught by a surviving support column, forming an arch I ducked through, over a scatter of small components across the floor, clicking against my boots. The ship creaked around me in the particular way of large damaged vessels, still settling into what they had become. The biological signal the scanner was tracking kept confusing the categorization system. Metal and organic in the same space, moving in the readings the way living things move, slow and purposeful and distributed. Something that was more than one thing. Something that existed in a category my scanner's library had no clean match for. I came through the last doorway and stopped. The armor organized the room around itself. Everything else in the chamber, the debris on the floor, the fallen ceiling section, the dim red emergency light, all of it existed in relation to the armor. It covered the floor from wall to wall in a space that had been a command chamber, before half the ceiling came down. Deep red-black, the color of the hull outside, but where the hull was inert material, the armor was alive. The surface moved in a slow rhythm, plates expanding and contracting by millimeters, the rhythm of something breathing, something in pain, and managing that pain with the specific stillness of a thing that has decided not to show it. Inside the armor, a figure enormous even by Karath standards. 6 limbs, 2 lower, 4 upper. The lower 2 were pinned under the fallen ceiling beam, which lay diagonally across the armor's lower half, with its full structural weight. The upper 4 were braced against the debris-covered floor, holding position with absolute stillness. Smooth helmet, no visible eye apertures, a horizontal sensor band across the front. Along the armor's left side, from midpoint to the upper assembly, ran a crack. Not a break, a crack. The edges of it seeping gold that was not quite fluid and not quite solid. Thin threads of it, advancing toward the gap and retreating, advancing and retreating, trying to bridge something and failing to bridge it. My scanner told me the rest. 1 life sign, stable but declining. Armor power at 14%. Seal integrity at the crack location stressed and holding but not holding well. Time to critical failure, somewhere between 5 and 7 hours. I took 1 step forward, then another. The helmet turned. The voice that came out of the armor did not need volume to carry weight in a room. "You are human," it said, in standard. "Yes," I said. "You are alone." "Yes." "My guard is dead. My crew is dead. My fleet does not know my position. The beam across my lower limbs cannot be moved without compromising the seal on my 3rd plate group, which would cause a cascade failure in the armor's life support. I have calculated this 14 times. A pause. I am Sarava. I am the unyielding. I am the 73rd Queen of the Karath Dominion, keeper of the... I know what the royal standard means, I said. How long have you been in here? She was quiet for a moment, as if the question had arrived from an unexpected direction. 11 hours, she said. All right, I said. I set my tool bag on the floor, opened it, and pulled out the scanner. I am Mara Voss. I fix things. Tell me about the crack while I assess the beam. I moved toward the beam, and the scanner started returning data. Dense Karath construction alloy, heavier than its dimensions suggested. Fractured at one end, that end resting on debris. The intact heavier end resting on the armor's lower limb sections at 2 contact points, both of them carrying a static load the armor was not designed for. Then I scanned the armor at those contact points and the reading stopped me. The alloy was not behaving like alloy. The scanner cycled through its mineral library and settled on nothing, because nothing in the library was right. The material was metal in its structure, but something else was threaded through the structure. Something biological. Something that moved in the readings the way living things move, with the slow, purposeful circulation of a system maintaining itself. The armor, and whatever it contained, were not separate things. They were one thing that happened to exist in 2 apparent forms. I noted all of this. I moved the scanner slightly, bringing my gloved hand close to the armor's surface in the process, and the armor's surface composition shifted. Minutely, barely measurable, but the shift was directed toward my hand, moving toward the proximity of my glove with a slow, purposeful quality that was not temperature response, and was not electromagnetic, and was not any other category my training gave me for why metal moves. I noted that too. I filed it. I moved on to the beam assessment, because the beam was the first problem, and everything else came after the first problem. I walked around the beam 3 times. My grandmother taught me to do this. She said walking around a problem is the first tool you have, and you use it before you pick up anything else. She said it while crouching next to broken marine engines on a dock where the sea smelled cold, and the boats needed to go out in the morning. I walked around this beam 3 times in the red emergency lighting of a Karath Queen's wrecked flagship, and I built the plan step by step, and I described it to Sarava. Build a support column under the fractured heavy end with fast-set foam and hull clamps so it does not drop. Run a mechanical cable from the Harriet's arm system to take the lift load on the intact lighter end. Slide the beam along its own axis, away from the armor, using the armor's lower limb sections as the slide rail because they are the smoothest surface available. You described that in 90 seconds, she said. 3 walkarounds to build it, I said. The describing is the easy part. I was already laying the first foam layer. Tell me about the third plate group while the foam cures. I need to understand the structure before I touch the crack. She told me. The third plate group formed the central support of the armor's left dorsal assembly. The plates maintained the primary seal between the armor's internal life support environment and the surrounding atmosphere. The seal operated through plate lock mechanisms and the living thread, which served as an adaptive biological layer at the bonding point that could respond to minor flexion in ways a purely mechanical seal could not. So the living thread is the seal, I said. It is the part of the seal that functions under variance, she said. If the thread cannot bridge the crack, the mechanical lock alone will not maintain seal integrity under pressure differential. And the thread cannot bridge, because your reserves are low, I said. She paused. How do you know my reserves are low? The biological signal is weaker than it was when I first came in, I said. The scanner is reading a depletion gradient. The armor is drawing from you to maintain itself, and you are drawing from the armor to maintain yourself, and both of you are running down at the same rate. Another pause. Longer. That is an accurate assessment, she said. The first foam layer was setting. I put on the second. What is the living thread made of? It is the biological component of the living iron, she said. It connects the armor to the wearer at a cellular level. It reads my biological state continuously. When I am at full capacity, the armor is at full capacity. When I am depleted, the armor reflects that, I said. Yes, I can see it in the readings. I was watching the seeping gold at the crack edge on my scanner, the threads of it advancing toward the gap and retreating, trying, running out of something to try with. The thread is attempting to bridge the crack on its own. It is getting close to the center but not completing the bridge. I know, she said. I can feel it. It has been trying for hours. I put on the third foam layer. While it cured, I ran the cable from the Harriet's arm system through the airlock, threading it carefully through the corridors, managing the angle around the collapsed ceiling section, keeping the line clean. Running cable in damaged confined spaces is a skill that takes longer to develop than most people expect, because the temptation is always to force it fast and straight, and the correct approach is almost always to follow the angles the space provides. You are making sounds I cannot identify, Sarava said. Cable running, I said. Mechanical lift system from my ship. Through the corridors I heard you navigate. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. You moved through those corridors quickly, she said. There were 3 collapsed sections. Moving cautiously in a damaged space makes it more dangerous, not less, I said. You read the angles, and you move at the speed the space gives you. The Karath trained collapse structure navigation as a specialized skill requiring months of certification, she said. I learned it by doing it, I said. It is not complicated once you understand that the structure is telling you where it is safe to move, if you pay attention to what it is saying. She was quiet again. The kind of quiet that meant she was processing something that did not fit into the categories she had been given for how knowledge worked. The 4th foam layer went on and cured. I tested the column hard with both hands. Solid. I hooked the cable to the lighter end of the beam, anchored it through a wall bracket I had assessed as structurally sound during my walkarounds, and checked the pull angle. Then I activated the cable system. The beam moved. Heavy things argue when you move them, and this one had a very large argument, a deep grinding protest that ran through the floor and into my boots. The lighter end came up. The fractured end settled into the foam column and the foam held. I watched the scanner as I slid the beam along the armor's lower limb sections. The contact load at those sections dropped with each centimeter. A centimeter. 5, 12, 20, 30. Clear. I released the cable tension slowly. The beam rested on the foam column and the debris pile, entirely off the armor. Move your lower limbs, I said. Both. Full range. Slow. She moved them. The armor followed without catching. She made a sound that came out before she decided to keep it in, and I recognized it, because relief sounds like itself in any voice. The lower section is damaged but functional, I said. The living thread there is working to restore plate alignment. I am going to leave that alone. I am going to focus everything on the crack. I had been thinking about the crack since the scanner showed me the surface composition shift when my hand came close to the armor. I had been thinking about what it might mean. Now I needed to think about it out loud. Before I touch the crack, I need to tell you something, I said. When I first scanned the armor, when my hand came close to the surface, the armor's surface composition shifted toward my hand. Not a temperature response, not electromagnetic. The armor was reaching toward my hand. She was very quiet. That is not the rejection response, she said. No, I said. It is the opposite of the rejection response, which means something about my presence is not foreign to this armor in the way a stranger's presence should be. I was pulling the scanner up to its high-resolution setting, and I found something else. I described the old repair seam. I described it completely and carefully, the position in the armor's structure, the scanner's age estimate, the human proportions of the handprint at the seam edge, the way the alloy had incorporated the repair so thoroughly it was almost indistinguishable from original material. When I finished, the chamber was quiet enough that I could hear the armor breathing. That is not possible, she said. The first time, a statement. Then, after a moment, that is not possible. The second time, a question she was asking herself. The scanner reading is what it is, I said. I want to test something. I want to put my bare hand against the armor surface next to the crack. Not on the crack. To the side of it, where the living thread concentration is highest. I want to see if the armor responds to direct contact the same way it responded to scanner proximity. The rejection response. You said it would be unpleasant, I said. I have managed unpleasant before. She did not tell me not to. I took off my right glove. The armor was warm under my palm, much warmer than the ambient temperature of the chamber, the warmth of a system working hard, and under my hand the surface changed, not the small measured shift of proximity. This was clear and directed, the surface composition of the armor moving toward my skin, with the unmistakable purposefulness of reaching. Through the crack, the living thread surged. It crossed the gap in one movement, bonded. The 2mm crack closed to a hairline and held. Sarava made a sound, large and complicated, and with more inside it than I had words for. The seal is restored, she said. The third plate group is holding. It will not hold without outside reinforcement, I said. I am going to weave copper lattice across the crack and anchor it. The lattice has the right thermal expansion profile to not stress the seal through temperature changes. I am going to bond it in place. That is human salvage material, she said. Yes, I said. And the armor has already told me it is willing to work with what I have. I put my glove back on and got out the copper lattice. While I worked the diamond weave across the crack, anchoring each intersection with bonding tape, she talked. I had asked her to. I work better when I am talking. She described the armor's history in a way that felt like she was describing her own history, because the two things were not entirely separate. The armor had had 72 queens before her. Each of them had left something in the living thread. Not memories, she said, but echoes. The shape of what they had felt. She had been wearing this armor for 9 years, and sometimes she could feel those echoes. The weight of what the people before her had carried, the presence of them in the metal. The old seam, I said, the human handprint, if the armor keeps echoes of significant events. It would have an echo, she said. Yes, a human repairing Royal Karath armor before formal contact between our kinds. That would be significant enough. She paused. I have worn this armor for 9 years, and never felt an echo I did not have a context for. An echo from a human would have had no context. I might not have recognized it. But now you have one, I said. Now I have one, she said. I finished the lattice weave. 3 minutes for the bonding tape to set. I ran the arc welder along the tape edges at the lowest setting, slow and even, the specific patience of a weld that needs to hold under forces I cannot fully predict. The smell of the weld mixing with the Karath atmosphere, iron and herbal, a combination I would never encounter anywhere else. The tape set. I scanned the sealed area from every angle. The copper lattice was inside the armor's structure, not resting against the surface. Inside it, the living thread had pulled it in, incorporated it at the molecular level, woven it into the bonding layer. The lattice was gone as a separate object. It was now part of the third plate group, as integrated as original material. As integrated as the old repair seam. I stared at the scanner for a long time. Something has changed, Sareva said. Yes, I said. The armor kept my copper lattice. The living thread incorporated it into the bonding layer. It is part of the armor's structure now. She was absolutely still. "That has never been recorded," she said. "I know," I said. "The handprint in the old seam was also never recorded." The armor hummed. It had hummed since the moment the thread bridged the crack, but now a new harmonic had entered the sound, a new note that had not been there before my copper lattice became part of its structure, something that had not existed in this armor before this hour. I could not say whether that was large or small. I could say it was real, and it was permanent. Then the floor shuddered under my feet, and the walls hummed, and the specific bass-frequency pressure wave of a Karath military fleet, dropping out of faster-than-light travel, arrived through every surface at once, felt in your back teeth and your chest cavity, before you heard it at all. Her fleet had arrived, and I was sitting on the floor of her wrecked ship in a canvas worksuit with a cracked faceplate helmet, and a lapsed salvage certification, and my grandmother's wrench in my bag. I stood up and started packing my tools. Dravak came through the doorway the way experienced commanders come through doorways, without looking at the doorway. He was already looking at the room. 4 eyes, horizontal, cataloging everything at once, threat assessment and status assessment running simultaneously, without requiring conscious direction, because 31 years had made them automatic. He found Sarava first. Something in his posture changed when he saw her standing. A brief release, quickly contained, of something he had been carrying since the fleet left its last position, relief, compressed back into professionalism, before it could become an expression. Then he found me. I was sitting on the floor next to my open tool bag, packing items back in the order they lived in it. Foam canisters, cable spool, hull clamps in their 3 sizes, bonding tape roll, arc welder, drivers and splice tools, scanner. I was working methodically, because a tool that goes back in its place is a tool you can find in the dark, and I have needed tools in the dark often enough that this is not a philosophy but a practice. Drevok looked at me the way experts look at something outside their reference library. He took in the canvas worksuit, the cracked helmet visor, the salvage rig quality of every item in my bag, and my general presence in a room I had absolutely no formal standing to be in. He processed all of it in a few seconds. "This human was present when you were located," he said to Sareva. He used standard, a deliberate choice. He wanted me to follow everything that was about to be said. "This human," Sareva said, "is why I am standing." Drevok looked at the armor, the look of an expert encountering something that falls outside his knowledge. He found the location of the repaired crack on the left side, the smooth surface where I had worked. He looked at it for a long time, from 3 angles, with the specific attention of someone who knew this armor in great detail and could see what was missing from it, and what had been added to it, even when both the missing and added things were invisible to normal inspection. "The 3rd plate group's seal was compromised," he said. "It was," Sareva said, "and has been addressed." "By Mara Voss," she said, "with her tools, her materials, her methods." He looked at me. "She is not a bonded engineer," he said. "No," Sareva agreed. "She is not Karath. No. She carries no certification recognized by the Dominion. She has no formal standing under the Guild of Armored Engineers Charter with respect to interventions in protected artifacts." He paused. He was building to something and doing it methodically, which was, I thought, probably how he did everything. By that charter, any uncertified alteration of a royal artifact by an unauthorized individual requires formal documentation, guild examination, and depending on the findings of that examination, potential prosecution under Dominion law for interference with a protected royal item. The penalties range from significant financial assessment to formal detention depending on the severity of the... "Drevok," Sareva said. He stopped. She let the stop sit for a moment. She let the room be quiet. Then she said it. "Who repaired my armor?" I have heard questions that change the atmosphere of a room. This was one of those questions. It did not ask for information because the information was already present, and everyone in the room knew what it was. It asked for acknowledgement, for the placing of what had happened in a position where it could not be administratively processed before it was first recognized as real. It asked him, and the boarding party members standing behind him, and the fact of the situation itself, to acknowledge what was standing in front of them. Sareva, standing at her full height, the armor moving with her in perfect fluid response, every system integrated, Every plate in the right relationship with every other plate. Performing above the baseline his instruments were certainly recording, and a new harmonic in the armor's hum that none of the 31 years of his experience had prepared him to hear. He looked at her. He looked at me. He looked at the armor. He looked at all three things, and he was a reasonable man. And reasonable men, when they stand in front of undeniable evidence, do the work of updating what they know to include what is in front of them. It is not comfortable work, and it takes longer than accepting what you already believed. But he was the kind of man who did it anyway. A human mechanic, he said. Correct, Sareva said. She repaired my armor. She did so alone, with equipment that should not have been sufficient for the task, using knowledge that no formal process has certified her to have, in conditions that should have prevented any successful outcome. She took one step forward. The armor moved with her perfectly, without a catch, without a hesitation, everything whole and responding. And it held. He was quiet for a long moment. His four eyes were doing the work of processing something that did not fit cleanly into any existing category, and he was doing it with the care of someone for whom categories mattered professionally, but accuracy mattered more. He inclined his head. It was not quite a bow. It was the controlled, precise gesture of a professional who has received a direction from someone with the authority to give it, and who is going to execute that direction professionally, regardless of whatever private reservations he may still be working through. I will prepare a formal record, he said. The Armored Engineers Guild will require your personal attestation as the wearer, regarding the nature and effect of the intervention. They will receive it, she said, in detail, including my attestation that the armor's living thread accepted the intervention without rejection, incorporated foreign material into its own structure by its own action, and has been performing above baseline since the repair. She looked at him steadily. Begin the record now. He inclined his head again. Then he looked at me. You will give a statement immediately. Yes, I said. Your tools and remaining materials will be submitted for guild examination. The tools I need returned, I said. The materials that went into the repair are inside the armor now. You can examine them through the armor's sensor readings. What is in my bag is what I did not use. His four eyes held on me for a moment. The guild will contact you within a standard Dominion cycle. All right, I said. I will give you my communication frequency. I work a moving route, but I check messages every day without exception. He nodded once. Then he stepped aside and the boarding party spread through the chamber, with the organized efficiency of a military unit that had done this work many times, recording everything, scanning the environment, documenting the site of a crisis that had not gone the way crises of this type usually went. Drevok led me to a secondary chamber the boarding party had cleared and set up with clean white lighting and a recording system I could not see. He sat across from me and I sat across from him, and he asked his questions in standard, precisely and in order, and I answered them in the same way. He asked about everything in sequence, what I detected on my scanner, what I read from the thermal signature, when I decided to board and why, how I got through the airlock, how I moved through the damaged corridors, how I assessed the beam and decided on the foam column approach, how I identified the crack location and determined that the third plate group bonding layer was the critical structure. When he asked about the crack and the living thread, I explained the scanner readings, the surface composition shift when my hand came close to the armor before I touched it, the way the thread was advancing and retreating at the crack edge, trying and failing to bridge the gap. When I described removing my glove and pressing my bare hand against the armor's surface, he stopped writing. You made direct contact with living royal armor without environmental protection, he said. Yes, I said. While you were aware that the rejection response could cause harm. I was aware of the possibility, I said. I was also aware that the armor had already demonstrated non-rejection behavior before I touched it. The surface composition shift toward my hand was recorded on my scanner before any direct contact. The armor was reaching toward me before I reached toward it. He held my eyes for a moment. And when you made contact, the living thread bridged the crack. Immediately, I said. The scanner barely caught the movement. It showed me the result within a fraction of a second of contact. He wrote something down, several things. Then he looked up. The copper lattice you applied to the crack, he said. You described the living thread as having incorporated it into the armor's bonding layer. Yes, I said. When I did the final scan after the repair was complete, the lattice was no longer on the surface of the armor. The scanner showed it integrated into the bonding layer structure. The living thread had pulled it into the alloy at a molecular level. He stopped writing again. That has never been recorded in guild documentation, he said. I know, I said. But it happened. Your own instruments will confirm it if you run a deep scan of the third plate group. The copper alloy signature will be present inside the bonding layer structure at precisely the location where I placed the external lattice. He looked at me for a long time. Then he wrote something else. The human handprint in the old repair seam, he said. Yes, I said. I will describe it as precisely as I can. I described it completely. The scanner reading, the position in the armor's structure, the age estimate, the proportions, the way the alloy had incorporated it so thoroughly that it was barely distinguishable from original material. I described the estimated age and what that meant in relation to the timeline of human Karath contact. I described how the surface composition shift toward my hand, before any contact, was consistent with the armor retaining a responsiveness to human presence from that prior intervention. He wrote all of it down. When I finished, he sat with his writing tool resting in his hand, and he looked at what he had written for a while. You are proposing, he said slowly, that this armor was in contact with a human individual several centuries before formal human Karath contact was established. I am reporting what my scanner showed me, I said. The interpretation is yours, and the guild's to make. But you have a proposed interpretation. I have a hypothesis that fits the evidence I observed, I said. The armor shows a historical human repair. The armor showed immediate non-rejection response to my contact, including surface orientation toward my hand before I touched it. The living thread incorporated my copper lattice without precedent. These things are consistent with the hypothesis that the armor has a retained responsiveness to human biological presence from the prior intervention. He put his writing tool down. You are a salvage worker, with a lapsed certification, who works alone, in a second-hand rig, he said. It was not an insult. It was a statement of facts he was trying to reconcile with the conversation he was having. Yes, I said. And you are proposing a hypothesis about the biological memory properties of living iron that the Guild of Armored Engineers has never in its history considered. I am reporting what I observed and offering the interpretation that fits it, I said. The Guild can accept or reject the interpretation based on their examination of the evidence. He looked at me for a very long time. You are an unusual person, he said. I fix things, I said. The fixing did not require me to be unusual. It required me to be present and to use what I had. He was quiet for a moment. In Karath's structure, he said, fixing things is a domain. You spend decades learning a domain until your knowledge within it is comprehensive and your knowledge outside it is minimal. A person who repairs armor and nothing else, for their entire career. The concept of someone who repairs whatever is in front of them because they have a general understanding of how broken things behave and what broken things need, is not a concept our professional taxonomy has a category for. I know, I said. And yet here we are, he said. Here we are, I agreed. He stood up. The statement is complete. You will be contacted by guild representatives. Be reachable. I will give you my communication details before I leave, I said. Do that, he said. He looked at me one final time. The specific look of a thorough and capable professional encountering something outside his reference library and deciding to file it accurately, rather than reshape it to fit existing categories. The Queen will want to speak with you before you depart. I know, I said. He led me back through the corridor, and I found Sarava waiting near the docking airlock, positioned there deliberately. I wanted to speak with you before you return to your ship, she said. I thought you might, I said. Sit with me for a moment, she said. There was a section of debris that formed a rough ledge against the wall. I sat on it. She lowered herself to something closer to my level, not fully seated, but less towering, and we were close enough to speak without the formality of distance between us. Tell me about your grandmother, she said. I looked at her. You have asked me twice about her already, I said, during the repairs. I know, she said. I want to understand her more fully. I have been thinking about her since you first mentioned her, and I think she is the key to understanding you. and I think understanding you is going to be important for a number of reasons." I looked at her for a moment. Then I told her. I told her about the dock, the specific smell of salt water and machine oil on a cold morning, the boats, which were functional rather than beautiful, designed for catching fish in waters that did not care whether you came home, the families that depended on those boats going out and coming back with something, and the way that dependency turned every broken engine into something that mattered immediately and concretely. My grandmother had not been trained to fix boat engines. She had learned to fix them because no one else could, and the boats needed to go out. She had started with basic engines and worked outward from there, taking things apart and understanding them and putting them back and doing this over and over until the understanding moved from her head into her hands, which is where understanding becomes useful. By the time I knew her, she could diagnose most engine problems by sound, by smell, by the specific vibration pattern of a machine that was not running the way it should. She never thought of herself as an expert. She thought of herself as someone who fixed things. "She is the one who told me to walk around a problem before I touch it," I said. "Yes," Sarava said. "You mentioned that." "It is the most important thing she taught me," I said. "More important than any specific technique. Understanding the problem before you start, seeing it from every angle, not beginning until you know what you are beginning." Sarava was quiet for a moment. "The Karath trains specialist technicians for years before they are certified to touch anything important," she said. "The Guild of Armored Engineers spends a minimum of 15 years in study and apprenticeship before granting even a provisional certification." She paused. "And you walked in here with a salvage bag and did in 6 hours what the Guild would have needed a team to accomplish, if they had been here." "The Guild would have had the right tools and the right training," I said. "I had different tools and different training. The result happened to be the same." "Not the same," she said. "The Guild would not have found the old seam. The Guild would not have known to press a bare hand against the armor's surface. The Guild would not have tried copper lattice." She looked at me. "The Guild would have done what the Guild knows how to do, which is excellent within its parameters. You did something outside every parameter that exists." "I used what I had," I said. "Yes," she said. "That is what I am trying to understand. You used what you had, in a situation where what you had should not have been sufficient, and it was." "It was sufficient because the armor helped," I said. "The armor met me more than halfway. Without the armor's response to my contact, I could not have bridged the crack. The copper lattice was a structural reinforcement. The living thread was the repair. The thread did the work. I just gave it the conditions to do the work." She was quiet for a long moment. "You are the only person who has ever described it that way," she said. "Everyone who has ever worked on this armor has described themselves as the one who fixed it. You are describing the armor as the one who fixed it, with your assistance." "I am describing what happened," I said. "Yes," she said. "I know." She looked at me. "That is also unusual." I did not say anything. "The Vethsoren recognition," she said. "I want to explain it more fully before I offer it formally." She explained it. "It was not a title," she said again. "It was not employment. It was a formal acknowledgement, entered into the Dominion's records and into the Royal Line's records separately, that a specific person had entered into a relationship with the Royal Line, that the Royal Line recognized and honored. The diplomatic marker was the practical expression of it. Any Karath vessel encountering me in Dominion space was required to treat me as an entity under royal recognition, which in practice meant I could not be detained, or taxed or inconvenienced, in the ways that individuals without formal standing in Dominion space could be. If the Royal Line had need of skills I possessed, I would be contacted first. I retained the right to decline, always. Compensation for any work I accepted would follow Karath standards, which were, she said simply, generous. "And the bond itself," I said. "What does it require of me on a daily basis?" "Nothing, on a daily basis," she said. "The Vethsoren bond is not a service contract. It is a recognition of a relationship. It creates an acknowledged connection between you and the Royal Line, formalized in the Dominion's records, that is permanent, unless formally dissolved by mutual agreement." I thought about this. I thought about the Harriet. I thought about Waypoint 11 and the cargo skiff sensor array job and the copper wire buyer. I thought about my life, which was mine, built from pieces at my own pace, by my own choices, and which was exactly what I needed it to be. "I will take the marker," I said. "The diplomatic recognition in Dominion space, but not the formal bond." She was quiet. "I know the bond is not a service contract," I said, "but it is a formal ongoing relationship with the royal line of the Karath Dominion, and that is larger than I am set up to be in relationship with. I work alone. I make decisions about specific problems as they present themselves. I cannot promise an ongoing formal relationship with anything. I can only promise to respond honestly if you contact me with a specific problem, and to come if I can, and to do my best work if I come." "That is not how the Veth-Soren bond works," she said. "I know," I said. "The Karath do not negotiate service arrangements," she said. "I know that too," I said. "But I am not negotiating a service arrangement. I am describing what I am capable of offering honestly, so that what you expect from me matches what I can actually provide." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought the answer was no, and I would walk back to the Harriet with only the memory of a very unusual day. "A marker," she said, "and an informal arrangement. You respond to contact at your own discretion." "Yes," I said. "That is all you have to offer." "It is all I have to offer anyone," I said. "It is not a small thing. I do not offer it carelessly." She sat with that. "I have never done anything informally in my life," she said. "I know," I said. "You are doing it now, and it is the right thing to do." She made a sound. Small, brief, complicated. I had been listening to her for several hours by this point, and I had some context for her sounds, and this one, in that context, with what I knew about the shape of it, I thought might be as close as a Karath queen, who had been in a suit of living armor for 9 years, and in a wrecked ship for 11 hours, and in a conversation with an unexpected human mechanic for the last several of those hours, could get to something that in another throat and another situation would have been a laugh. "The marker will be registered," she said. "The arrangement will be noted in my personal records, not in the Dominion's formal registry." "That works," I said. "I will have the old seam researched," she said. "The armor's provenance records are comprehensive. If a human was involved in a previous repair, there will be evidence in the historical archive somewhere. I want to find it, and I will contact you when I do." "I will answer," I said. "Good," she said. She rose back to her full height. "Before you go, the fuel regulator you mentioned, running warm." "Before waypoint 11, I said. "Before waypoint 11, she confirmed. "Not after." "Yes," I said. She looked at me one last time. Whatever the Karath equivalent of looking is when you are doing it through a sensor array in a helmet that shows no eyes. The full attention of her, through the armor and through the new note the armor had developed in the last few hours, through everything that made her Sarava specifically. "Mara Voss," she said. "Yes," I said. "You are a difficult thing to categorize," she said. "I know," I said. "Most things worth doing fall slightly outside the available categories." I walked back through the corridors of the wrecked flagship for the last time. The boarding party had set up temporary lighting in the main passages, white strips at eye level that made the damage look different from the red emergency light I had been working in, more clinical, more precise. You could see, in the clean white light, the exact nature of what the battle had done to this ship, the specific character of each failure, the places where the hull had been stressed beyond its design parameters, and the places where it had held past any reasonable expectation, and finally given. I have walked through damaged ships many times. You develop a sense for what they are saying. This ship had been very good, and had been through something it was not quite designed to handle, and it had made a better account of itself than whatever it had been fighting had anticipated. That was what the damage pattern said. You could read it in which sections held and which sections went first. The boarding party members I passed looked at me differently than Drevik had. Drevik had spent 31 years developing the professional capacity to process unexpected things with something like equanimity. The boarding party members were looking at me the way people look at something they do not have a word for yet, and are not sure whether to file under interesting or alarming. I went through the Karath emergency airlock, cycling it open with the flat pry bar technique I had developed on the way in, and into the Harriet's secondary corridor. The hatch sealed behind me, and I heard the Harriet's systems respond. The slight change in pressure readings, the environmental controls adjusting. I was back inside something that knew me. I unsealed the docking clamps from inside and felt the Harriet pull free of the wrecked flagship's hull. A small lurch as the physical connection broke, and the two ships became separate objects in space again, each with their own trajectory, their own momentum, their own relationship with the void around them. I took my helmet off. The Harriet smelled like machine oil and old coffee, and the specific plastic-metal combination of a ship that has been worked on so many times that the working is what it smells like. It is the best smell I know. It is the smell of something that belongs to me, built by my hands, running because I made it run, carrying me because I decided what it would carry. I sat down at the workbench in the back of the cabin, and I took everything out of my tool bag in the order it lived in the bag. I checked each item and put each one back in its place. The scanner, clean and undamaged. The drivers and splice tools, each in their slot. The bonding tape roll, most of it used. The foam canisters, both empty. The hull clamps, still functional. The arc welder, and at the bottom, wrapped in its cloth, my grandmother's wrench. I unwrapped it and held it for a moment in both hands. It had belonged to her. She had used it on marine engines on a cold dock for 30 years before she gave it to me, which means it is older than I am by decades and has been used hard for most of its existence. There is a specific quality that tools develop when they have been used well and long, a quality of being exactly what they are, without apology or excess. The wrench had this quality. It was a marine wrench, not designed for space work, and it did not pretend to be anything else. It was useful for the angles that nothing designed for space work could reach, precisely because it was not designed for space work, and therefore had different proportions and a different reach. I thought about the handprint in the old seam. 5 fingers. Human proportions, pressed into living iron several centuries ago by someone who had been there alone, as I had been there alone, with whatever tools they had, as I had had my tools, doing something that nobody had any record of, and nobody had certified them to do, just fixing something, just doing it right, just leaving the work and going home, or whatever home meant for someone who pressed a handprint into Karath royal armor in a period before humanity and the Karath had any formal awareness of each other. I wondered what they had been, not what their job title was, or what their certification said, because those things clearly did not apply to the situation they had been in. I wondered what they were in the way that matters, what they carried with them when they walked into something they had no business touching, and figured it out anyway, whether they had learned it the way I learned it, from watching someone who learned it the same way, back through a chain of people who fixed things because things needed fixing, and they were present, and they had enough of the right kind of knowledge to start. I wondered if they knew what they had left behind, if they had any idea that the armor was going to keep them, that the living thread was going to incorporate the touch of their hands into its own structure and carry it for centuries, that some morning several hundred years later, a scanner was going to find the print, and someone with the same kind of hands was going to stand there in the red emergency light and understand what it meant. Probably not. You usually do not know what you leave behind. You do the work and you go, and the work stays, or it does not, and you are usually somewhere else entirely by the time you find out which. I wrapped the wrench back in its cloth and put it at the bottom of the bag. Then I brought the Harriet's navigation system up and set a course for waypoint 11, and let her idle up to her cruising speed. Her cruising speed was not impressive. It was adequate and consistent, and I had calibrated it to her specific capabilities, over 7 years of understanding exactly what she could and could not do, and adequate and consistent was everything I needed. I went to the engine room and pulled the panel on the secondary fuel regulator. The temperature sensor was reading 3 degrees warm, which I had known for 2 days, and had been meaning to address before other things became more urgent. I ran the diagnostic sequence on the flow management system and found what I expected to find, a slight calibration drift in the control valve that was causing the fuel flow to run marginally high and the temperature to run correspondingly warm as a result. It was not a dangerous condition. It was an inefficient one, and inefficiency in a ship running on salvage income is a practical problem even if it is not an immediate crisis. I recalibrated the control valve. This required removing a panel that was awkward to access and working in a position that was not comfortable, and using 3 tools in sequence to make adjustments that took precision and patience. I have done this calibration procedure on the Harriet twice before, both times under less than ideal conditions. 40 minutes of work, When I was done, the regulator was reading normal. I tested it twice. Normal both times. I went back to the pilot's console and checked the heading and looked at the stars. The stars outside the viewport were the same stars they had always been, ancient and indifferent and distributed across the dark in the way they had been distributed since before there were eyes to look at them. They did not notice that something unusual had happened in the debris field behind me. They were not interested in unusual. They were interested in the physics of very large things and very long timescales, which does not have much overlap with the concerns of individual people in individual ships on individual days. I was fine with that. The stars not noticing was part of their appeal. I looked at the Harriet systems panel. Everything was reading normal. Fuel regulator at correct temperature, main drive at standard output, environmental systems nominal, life support clean. All 17 patched sections of hull, showing the same pressure integrity they had shown for the last 6 months, since the last time I had gone around checking them. Good ship. Mine. I pulled up the salvage manifest and went through the hold inventory. The copper wire coils were in the best condition of anything I had collected. Clean alloy, minimal oxidation, good for resale at the rate I had mentally budgeted for them. The hull plate sections were more variable. 3 of them were worth full market rate, 5 were worth half, and 2 were worth whatever the broker at Waypoint 11 felt like offering for scrap-grade material, which was not much, but was still more than leaving them in the debris field. The 3 power coupling housings were the most valuable items in the hold, and also the most likely to require a specialist buyer at the station, because coupling housings were not a general market item, and I would need to find the right buyer, rather than just taking them to the General Materials Exchange. I made notes on what approach to take with each item. This was the part of salvage work that most people who romanticized the job from the outside did not think about. Finding things was the interesting part. Selling them was the work that made finding them worthwhile. You developed relationships with buyers over time, learned their preferences and their limitations, figured out when to push for a better price, and when to take the offered rate and move on. I had been working Waypoint 11 for 3 years, and I knew its market well enough to have a specific plan for most of what was in my hold. After the cargo skiff sensor array job, there was a fuel invoice to pay and a service on the Harriet's secondary drive bearing that I had been scheduling for the past 2 months and should not push further. The bearing was not failing yet, but it was going to fail, and the optimal time to service a bearing is before it fails, rather than during the failure, which is a general principle applicable to most things in most contexts. I made notes on all of this. I made good notes because good notes are how you remember what you meant to do, and how you hold yourself accountable to the plan you made when you were thinking clearly. The communication system on the Harriet's console was not elaborate, but it worked. It had a standard union frequency, a salvage authority channel, and a general emergency hail. I added a new entry to the contact registry. It took me 3 tries to get the Karath diplomatic communication format right, because I had never had occasion to enter one before. But the format was in the Harriet's reference library, and after 3 tries I had it correct. Queen Sareva, Dominion Royal Contact, Priority Channel. I looked at the entry for a moment, then I went back to the manifest. The sensors pinged a routine alert. New debris in the area, small, not worth the course deviation. I dismissed it. Outside the viewport, the stars moved in their slow way, which is to say they did not move at all, but the Harriet moved past them, and so they appeared to move, an illusion produced by the ship being the thing that was actually changing position. I was 3 hours into the run to Waypoint 11 when the Harriet's long-range communication system registered an incoming signal. The format was one I had never received before. Karath diplomatic encryption, formal registration, priority channel. I opened it. It was a text message, not a voice transmission. The text was in standard, precise and formal. It said, "The armor is performing at 104% of its pre-battle baseline. The Guild of Armored Engineers has begun their examination of the third plate group. Their preliminary assessment, which Drevak has relayed to me, describes the copper integration as unprecedented in the Guild's documented history. They are requesting a full interview with you at your earliest availability. Also, the Historical Archive team has been assigned to research the old repair seam. This is being treated as a priority inquiry. I have assigned my personal historian to lead it. Also, check the left forward hull clamp mount on your rig. I could see from the chamber doorway that it was running at an angle that will cause torque stress at the connection point under sustained load." I sat and looked at the message for a moment. Then I went to the Harriet's external camera feed and pulled up the left forward clamp mount. She was right. The mount was running slightly off its optimal angle. Not dangerous, not yet, but the kind of thing that becomes dangerous if you do not correct it before it becomes something more than slightly off. I noted it on my maintenance list. I would fix it before waypoint 11, during the same session as the drive bearing service. I wrote back. I said, "Thank you for the update on the armor's performance. Tell the guild I can make myself available at waypoint 11 in 4 days, if they can send a representative there, or remotely in 2 days, if they can use standard transmission. Tell your historian that I am happy to answer any questions they have about the scanner readings. Also, you were right about the clamp mount. I will address it before I dock at waypoint 11. I sent it. The Karath encryption system processed it in a way that was slightly slower than Union encryption, and then showed the sent confirmation. I sat at the console for a while, not doing anything specific, just sitting and looking at the stars, and the darkness between them, and the long distance between where I was and where I was going. In a debris field somewhere behind me, the Karath fleet was doing the work of recovery, pulling the wrecked flagship back to where it could be properly assessed and repaired, recovering whatever could be recovered from what had been lost, doing the large, careful work of putting back together what a battle had taken apart. They were very good at that work, and they would do it well, and the ship would eventually be what it needed to be again. In the third plate group of an armor that was nearly as old as the Dominion itself, copper salvage wire that had been sitting in a roll in my bag that morning was now part of something ancient, incorporated, made permanent, in the living iron, the way the old repair seam was permanent, the way the handprint at the edge of the old seam was permanent, made into part of the history of a thing that had been through 73 queens and hundreds of years, and at least 2 human hands, and was, by every measurement available to me, doing better than it had been before I put my hands on it. I thought about that for a while, about what it means to leave something behind in a thing that will outlast you by centuries, about whether the person whose handprint I had found had known what they were leaving, and whether it had mattered either way. The Harriet's engine settled into its cruising rhythm, even and reliable, the sound of a ship doing exactly what it was designed to do, with no drama and no complaint. I liked that sound. I had built it and maintained it, and I knew every note in it, including the very slight irregularity in the idle that I had chosen to leave alone, because it was not causing a problem. I made a cup of coffee from the machine that was older than my certification, drank it at the console, and went through the rest of the cargo manifest. Waypoint 11 was not beautiful, and it was not large, and it was not the kind of place that attracted people who had other options. What it was useful. It sat at the intersection of 3 trade corridors that crossed the outer spiral region, which meant that regardless of what was happening in the larger politics of the sector, things kept passing through Waypoint 11, because things had to pass through somewhere, and this somewhere was more convenient than the alternatives. The station had been continuously occupied for about 90 years, and had accumulated all the specific character of a place that has been functional and unglamorous for a very long time. It smelled like recycled air and commercial cooking, and the particular petroleum-adjacent scent of ships being serviced at close range. Every surface had been repaired too many times to look new anymore. The people who lived there had the unhurried competence of people who have been doing the same thing in the same place, long enough to have stopped needing to explain themselves. I docked at my usual berth, which was in Section 12, mid-station, adjacent to the Commercial Materials Exchange. The docking attendant was a man named Carl, who had been there for all 3 years of my acquaintance with Waypoint 11, and who processed my arrival with the same minimal formality he applied to every arrival: a scan of my ident, a confirmation of the berth assignment, and a warning about the Section 11 walkway being closed for maintenance. I spent the first day at the station doing what I always did at the start of a Waypoint 11 visit. The copper wire went to the buyer I had been dealing with for 18 months, a woman named Della who ran a materials reclamation operation out of a warehouse near the fuel depot. She paid me the rate I had budgeted for, and we spent 20 minutes talking about the market for secondary alloys, which was her area of professional interest, and one I had enough knowledge of to follow the conversation intelligently, without being able to contribute anything she did not already know. She always appreciated that. It is rare to find a salvager who will ask good questions about secondary alloy markets, rather than just talking about their own hull. The hull plates went to the broker on the exchange floor. 3 at full rate, 5 at half, 2 at scrap grade, as I had estimated. The broker was a man named Phil, who I had developed a decent working relationship with over 3 years, and who drove a harder bargain than was strictly necessary, because driving hard bargains was how he defined doing his job well, and I respected that, even when it cost me a few % on the transaction. The power coupling housings took 2 days to sell because the right buyer was not on station when I arrived and had to be contacted and come in specifically. He was an engineering services contractor named Owen who serviced ships in the outer corridor and who was very knowledgeable about power coupling specifications and spent most of our transaction verifying that the housings I had were actually what he needed, rather than something adjacent to what he needed that would cause problems when installed. I answered his questions accurately and completely, including about the ones where the honest answer was that I did not know the specific detail he was asking about, but here was what the scanner showed, and he could assess it from there. He bought all 3. The cargo skiff sensor array job was straightforward. The ship's owner was a woman named Grace, who ran a small courier service between 3 stations in the outer corridor, and who treated her ship with the specific anxious attention of someone who depended on it entirely and could not afford to have it stop working. The sensor array damage was debris impact. A small piece of something from the same battle I had been working had found her ship in a parking orbit and removed a section of the forward sensor housing cleanly, the way small fast things sometimes do. I replaced the housing with a unit from my spares inventory and ran the calibration sequence and tested the result in 3 modes and showed her the test results. She paid promptly and tipped me 10% of the job rate and told me she had recommended me to 2 other courier operators working the same corridor. That was how the work went, mostly. You did good work and people told other people and more work came. It was not fast and it was not glamorous, and it was entirely reliable. The Guild of Armored Engineers reached me on day 3 of my Waypoint 11 stay. The representative was a transmission rather than a physical presence. A Karath engineer named Sevrath, whose formal title took half a minute to render fully, and who I addressed by the shortened form, Sev, which she accepted without visible offense. The transmission came through on the Karath diplomatic channel, which flagged differently from my normal communications, and the call quality was better than standard transmissions, the Dominion apparently investing seriously in its communication infrastructure. Sev had questions and I answered them, all of the same questions Drevik had asked, in more technical depth. She was particularly interested in the scanner readings from the moment of my first approach to the armor, the surface composition shift, the exact readings before and after direct contact, the rate of the thread's bridge movement, and the scanner's deep structure readings of the bonding layer before and after I placed the copper lattice. I had saved all of the scanner's raw data files. I had done this automatically, the same way I saved raw data from every significant scan, because you never know what the data will be useful for, and storage is cheap. I sent the files to Sev during the transmission, and she spent several minutes reviewing them while we were still in communication. The surface composition shift before contact, she said. You are describing a directed response toward your hand's position. Toward my hand's proximity, I said. I had not touched the armor. My hand was approximately 10 centimeters from the surface. And the shift was directional, not a general surface change. Definitively directional, I said. The scanner showed the composition change moving toward my hand's position, along a vector that matched my hand's location. She was quiet for a moment. The living thread does not orient to non-Karath biological presence, she said. That is foundational to how living iron behaves. The orientation response is coded to the wearer's bloodline. It is not a learned behavior. It is a property of the material itself. I understand that is the established understanding, I said. The scanner showed me something different from the established understanding. That is why I mentioned the old repair seam. Another pause. The old repair seam, she said, in the specific tone of someone who has been thinking about a particular piece of information since they first heard it, and has not finished thinking about it yet. You believe the prior human contact altered the living thread's orientation response. I believe the prior human contact is the most plausible explanation for the orientation response I observed, I said. I am not a biologist or a metallurgist. The mechanism is beyond my expertise, but the sequence of evidence is prior human contact, repair incorporated into the armor's structure. Armor shows non-standard orientation response to human biological proximity. The connection between those facts is the interpretation that fits them best. The scan data you sent me is going to require extensive analysis, she said. This is not a simple examination. I know, I said. You understand that if your hypothesis is correct, it has significant implications for our understanding of living iron's biological memory properties. I assumed it might, I said. That is the Guild's domain. I am just telling you what my scanner showed me. She was quiet for a long moment. You modified the scanner yourself, she said. The data you sent shows it is running at significantly higher resolution and broader material classification than standard factory configuration. 3 modifications over 7 years, I said. I needed it to read materials it was not originally designed to read. What materials? Kareth hull alloy was one, I said. I was doing a lot of salvage work in Kareth debris fields, and the standard mineral identification library could not distinguish Kareth military alloy from several Union-grade materials that sell at very different market rates. So I reconfigured the identification algorithm. She was quiet in a different way than she had been quiet before. You reconfigured a Union civilian scanner to identify Kareth military alloys, she said. Yes, I said. Without formal training in Kareth materials science. Without formal training in Kareth materials science, I confirmed. Another pause. Mara Voss, she said. Yes, I said. I have been a guild engineer for 22 years, she said. I have worked with every class of living iron in the Dominion's armory inventory. I have examined repairs performed by bonded specialists who have spent 30 years becoming experts in their specific domain. Yes, I said. I am looking at your scanner data right now, she said, and what your modified civilian scanner captured from the armor's bonding layer is more detailed than what our guild instruments captured from the same location during our initial examination of the third plate group. I did not say anything. I am going to need you to send me the full modification specifications for your scanner, she said, not to replicate them, to understand how a civilian salvage instrument was reconfigured to capture data at this resolution. I can describe what I did, I said. I did not document the process formally. I made the modifications as I needed them and adjusted as I went. Describe it to me as completely as you can, she said. Start from the first modification. I described all 3 modifications. The material identification reconfiguration, which had involved accessing the scanner's classification algorithm and building a new reference library for Kareth alloys from sample scans I had collected from 6 different debris fields over 2 years. The biological signal detection enhancement, which I had added after I started encountering vessels that carried organic crew in configurations that the standard scanner missed, resulting in 2 close calls with life signs I had not identified before I was already inside a ship. The deep structure mapping function, which I had added most recently, when I started working debris fields dense enough that I needed to understand the internal structure of objects before I committed to extracting them rather than after. Sev listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. You built a better scanner, she said, from an existing civilian scanner, through iterative modification driven by specific operational needs. I built a scanner that does what I need it to do, I said. Whether it is better depends on the use case. For diagnosing living iron, she said, it is better. The data I am looking at is more complete than what our guild instruments produced. A pause. I am going to note this formally in my examination report. The instrument used in the initial repair diagnosis, while not guild certified, produced data of higher quality than Dominion standard examination instruments. That is going to require explanation in the report. I am sorry if that creates a complicated situation, I said. It creates an accurate situation, she said. Complicated and accurate are not the same thing. Accurate is required. Complicated is manageable. Another pause. I will need to follow up with you after my analysis of the scan data. Are you likely to be reachable at this station for the next few days? I am here for 2 more days, I said. After that I am doing a loose run through the outer corridor. I will have communication access throughout. Good, she said. Expect contact in 3 days. She closed the transmission. I sat at the Harriet's communication console for a moment after the call ended. Outside the dock viewport, Section 12 of Waypoint 11 carried on its business. Cargo loaders moving between berths, a fuel delivery vehicle making its rounds, Two salvage rigs from the outer corridor parked side by side near the maintenance bay with their crews, doing the specific standing around the problem posture of people who have not yet decided on the approach. I watched them for a moment. One of the crew members walked around their rig 3 times before stopping and pointing at something under the forward section. The other crew member nodded, and they both crouched down to look. I understood that. The next communication came 2 days later, the morning I had planned to leave the station. It came again on the Karath diplomatic channel, but it was not Sev, and it was not the guild. The identification header showed Sarava's priority channel. It was a voice message this time, 12 seconds long. She said, "My historian has found the first thread of evidence. It is going to take several months to follow. I wanted you to know we have found it. Also, how is the clamp mount?" I recorded a reply. I said, "I fixed the clamp mount on day 1. I am glad the historian found something. I will be interested to hear what they find. The guild representative reached me 2 days ago. Tell her the scanner specifications are more complicated than a single conversation can cover, but I will make myself available for follow-up." I sent it. Then I brought the Harriet's departure systems up, did the check sequence in the order I always did the check sequence, and cleared the dock. Waypoint 11 fell behind me, and the outer corridor spread out ahead of me, long and dark, and full of the specific mixture of things that needed fixing, and things that were already fixed, and things that had not decided yet. I set a heading for the first stop on my loose run, a depot station 2 days out, where I had 2 repair jobs scheduled, a navigation array calibration, and an atmospheric recycler overhaul. Both were good work. Both paid the rate I had asked for. Both would take my full attention when I got there, and I would do them carefully and completely, and then I would move on to the next thing. That was the work. That was the life. I had added a Karath diplomatic channel to my communication registry, and a note in my maintenance schedule about following up with the guild in 3 days, and a personal entry in my log about an old repair seam in living iron, and what it might mean about the way that things persist longer than the people who make them, carrying forward, waiting, connecting hands across centuries in the dark. Otherwise, nothing had changed. The Harriet ran at her usual adequate and consistent speed. The stars held their position in the way they always held position, indifferent and ancient, the permanent reference points around which everything smaller moved. I checked the manifest for the first depot stop and started thinking about the navigation array calibration, what I would need to know before I started, how I would approach it, what the likely failure points were for that model of array in that class of ship, and what questions I would ask the owner before I touched anything. 3 walkarounds first, then the plan, then the work. Same as always. The follow-up from Sev came on day 3, as she had said it would. It was a long transmission, longer than the first, and she spent most of it on the scanner data. The deep structure mapping of the bonding layer was what she was most interested in. She had run the same scan with guild instruments after my call, and confirmed that my scanner's data was, in fact, more complete. The resolution difference came from the modification I had made to the mapping frequency algorithm, which was running at intervals that standard guild instruments did not use, because the standard guild instruments had been designed to read living iron in controlled conditions, and my scanner had been modified to read it under whatever conditions it was actually in. She had a name for what my scanner had captured in the bonding layer after the repair. She called it a resonance signature. It was the specific pattern that living thread left in the alloy when it had incorporated a new material, a kind of recording in the molecular structure of the iron, of the event that had changed it. Guild instruments looked for it after major repairs, she said, to verify that the thread had fully integrated the work, but they had never seen one that included foreign material at this level of integration. "The copper alloy you used," she said, "is present in the bonding layer at a concentration and distribution that the thread normally only achieves with Karath royal bloodline material during the initial forging process. The thread did not simply accept the copper, it incorporated it the same way it incorporates its original components." "What does that mean for the armor's function?" I said. "We do not fully know yet," she said. "The armor is performing above baseline, as you know. The third plate group is performing above its pre-damage baseline, which is not typical for a repaired section. Repaired sections usually perform at or slightly below the original baseline because the repair, even an excellent repair, is never quite the same as the original structure. This section is performing above the original, which suggests the incorporation of the copper, combined with the thread's response to it, has produced a bonding layer that is in some properties stronger than what was there before. The armor kept what worked, I said. She was quiet for a moment. That is an interesting framing, she said. Living systems do that, I said. Repair is how living things adapt. If the material that came in during a repair is useful, the system keeps it and integrates it. If it is not, the system rejects it. The armor kept the copper because the copper was useful. The established understanding of living iron does not include adaptive response to foreign materials at this level, she said. I know, I said. But the established understanding of living iron was built from observations of living iron under controlled conditions. I gave it a very uncontrolled condition, and it did something it had not been observed doing before. She was quiet again, longer this time. The old repair seam, she said finally. Your hypothesis is that the prior human contact created a persistent change in the living thread's orientation response. Yes, I said. And that the persistent change is what allowed the thread to orient toward your contact rather than rejecting it. And allowed the copper to be incorporated rather than rejected. Yes, I said. The thread had a century-long memory of responding to human biological presence without rejection. When I arrived with human biological presence and human material, the thread responded consistently with that memory. Living iron does not have memory in the way you are describing, she said. But she said it differently from the way she had said it the first time we talked about it. The first time had been a definitive statement about established fact. This time, it sounded like someone testing whether the established fact still held. I think it does, I said. I think it has a kind of memory that is different from what memory usually means. Not a record of events, a record of responses. The thread does not remember what happened. It remembers how it responded to what happened. And a response pattern that was established strongly enough, through an event significant enough, can persist. That is a significant revision to living iron theory, she said. Yes, I said. You are proposing it on the basis of one set of observations with a modified civilian scanner. I am proposing it on the basis of evidence, I said. The evidence is what it is. The proposal is for the Guild to test it with proper instruments in controlled conditions. I am not asking the Guild to accept my interpretation. I am asking the Guild to examine whether the evidence supports it. She was quiet for a long time. I am going to recommend, she said slowly, that the Guild designate the examination of this armor as a priority research project, rather than a standard repair verification audit. That seems appropriate, I said. And I am going to recommend that you be listed as a contributing external observer in the project documentation, she said, not as a Guild member, as an external individual whose observations initiated the inquiry. That works, I said. It is unusual, she said. I know, I said. Most things that turn out to matter started as something unusual. She made a sound that I could not interpret over the transmission quality, somewhere between professional acknowledgement and something warmer than that. She closed the transmission shortly after. The depot station I had been running toward appeared on my scanner 2 days later, right on schedule. I docked, did the navigation array calibration and the atmospheric recycler overhaul, received payment, moved on. The outer corridor continued, one stop at a time, the ordinary rhythm of the work. The message from Sarava's historian came 6 weeks after I had left Waypoint 11. It was not a short message. The historian's name was rendered in standard as something close to Veth-Kavan, which she asked me to shorten to Kavan in our communications, and she had been working the archive for the full 6 weeks without, she said, sleeping as much as she should have. She had found the thread she was looking for. Multiple threads, in fact. The evidence was scattered across 4 different archive collections in 3 separate Dominion repositories, and it had taken 6 weeks to find it, because none of it had been catalogued together, and some of it had not been catalogued at all, existing only as peripheral references in documents, primarily about something else. The armor was 712 years old. The repair seam I had found was dated, through her archival work combined with the scanner's estimate, to approximately 430 years ago, which placed it during a period called the Long Silence in the Dominion's history, a century and a half, when the Dominion had been turning inward after an expansion period, and most formal external contact had been suspended. During the Long Silence, Contact with non-Karath species had not been officially recognized, but the trade routes that had developed during the expansion period did not stop because official contact was suspended. They continued, informally, at the margins of Dominion space, where individual traders and ship crews were less visible than formal fleets and diplomatic missions. She had found 3 references to human traders working the Dominion's outer margins during the long silence. 2 were brief mentions in ledger records, names in standard phonetic transliteration that she could not fully recover. The 3rd was a passage in a memoir written by a Karath border official who had served on the outer margin stations during the same period. The official described, in passing, an encounter with a human repair worker who had been brought in to address damage on a Dominion vessel that had sustained impact during a debris field crossing. The memoir passage said, in Caven's translation, that the human repair worker had unusual hands for a small creature, and that she worked quickly and without instruction in a way that made the official uncomfortable because it was difficult to oversee something being done too fast to follow, and that the repair she made had held for the full remaining service life of the vessel. She. The memoir used a feminine pronoun. Cavan had checked this 3 times. A human woman. Outer Dominion margin. 430 years ago. Doing repair work that held for decades. The memoir did not name her. The ledger references were too fragmentary to recover a name. She existed in the archive as a set of peripheral mentions, a figure at the edges of other people's records, doing work that other people noted only insofar as it was surprising, and then moved on from. But she was there. The evidence of her was there. And the armor had kept her handprint for 4 centuries. And when I had come along with the same kind of hands it had reached for me, the same way it had reached for her, and I had not known what I was feeling when the armor's surface shifted toward my palm, but now I had a name for it. It was recognition. I sat with Cavan's message for a long time. I read it twice. I looked at the scanner data from the old repair seam on my console screen, the handprint still visible in the deep structure mapping, 5 fingers, human proportions, pressed into living iron by someone who had been there 4 centuries before me. I thought about her, about what she had carried when she came to that ship, about what she had known and what she had figured out on the spot, and what she had done with the combination, about how she had worked quickly without instruction, in a way that was difficult to oversee, which sounded familiar, about how the repair had held for the full remaining service life of the vessel, which was all any repair needed to do. I thought about what it would have meant to her to be there, in a space where she had no business being, doing something nobody had certified her to do, in contact with the most significant piece of living material in the Dominion's history. Whether she had known, whether it had felt large to her, the way it felt large to me when I stood in the red emergency light and understood what the scanner was showing me. Probably not. Large things rarely feel large in the moment you are doing them. They feel like problems that need solving. The largeness is something you find out about later, if you find out about it at all. I wrote back to Cavan. I said, "Thank you for finding this. The memoir passage, the feminine pronoun, the reference to working quickly without instruction. Those things are consistent with what I know about how this kind of work gets done. I would like to know more about the outer margin stations from that period, if there is more to find. Not because I expect to recover her name, but because understanding the context of what she was doing there might tell us something about how the armor came to be accessible to her at all." Cavan wrote back within a day. She said, "I am already pursuing that question. The records are thin, but they exist. The long silence was not as complete as the official history suggests. Give me another month." I gave her another month. I kept working. The outer corridor, stop by stop, navigation arrays and atmospheric systems and hull stress assessments, and one very complicated power plant diagnostic on a research vessel whose engineer had left the job midway through a repair and left the system in a state that required me to understand what the previous engineer had been trying to do before I could understand why it had not worked. I spent 2 days on that job. I charged for both days. I sent the research vessel on its way with a working power plant and a documented diagnosis that would tell the next engineer who touched it exactly what had been done and why. That was important, the documentation. The previous engineer had left no notes, and the absence of notes had made my job significantly harder, and the research vessel's situation significantly more precarious than it needed to be. I always left notes. not because anyone required them, because the next person who touched what I had touched deserved to know what they were working with. The month passed. Kavan sent another message, longer than the first. She had found more. The outer margin stations had maintained unofficial records, separate from the Dominion's formal archive, records kept by the station officials for their own purposes, and never submitted to the central repository. Several of those unofficial records had survived in a secondary archive that Kavan described as disorganized to the point of being nearly unusable, and which she had spent 3 weeks working through. The outer margin stations during the long silence had been, as she had suspected, more active than the official record suggested. They had maintained regular contact with human traders, who brought goods and services that the Dominion needed, and could not easily source internally during the inward-turning period. The arrangements were informal and deniable, exactly the kind of thing that border officials develop when official policy conflicts with practical necessity. Among the services that had passed through those stations was repair work. The outer margin ships took damage in the debris fields of that region, as ships always had, and the nearest guild engineers were weeks away in the interior. Human repair workers who came with the traders or who worked the same routes independently had filled that gap, informally, off the record, in the space between what was officially permitted and what was practically necessary. She had found 3 more references to a human woman, matching the description in the memoir. 2 were in the unofficial station records. 1 was in a personal letter, written by a Karath captain to a family member, describing a repair made to his ship's hull by a human woman who had charged him what he considered a reasonable rate and completed the work in less time than any guild engineer he had ever hired. The captain noted in the letter that he did not know her name and had not asked, because asking names in informal arrangements was not customary in that context. The 4th reference was in the unofficial station log of the border station, closest to where the long silence period armor had been recorded as being transported for an emergency repair. The log noted, in the terse style of official logs, that a human repair contractor had been engaged to address damage to a Dominion transport's equipment. The equipment in question was listed in the log's coded shorthand, and Kavan had needed 2 days to decipher the code, but she had deciphered it. The equipment was the armor. The armor had been on a transport ship. The transport had been damaged. The armor had sustained damage in the impact that also damaged the transport. The nearest guild engineers were weeks away. A human repair contractor had been available at the border station. And someone had made a decision that fell outside every protocol and every formal permission structure and every category of thing that was officially possible. A decision made because the alternative was leaving the armor damaged for weeks. And the armor was the armor, and leaving it damaged for weeks was not acceptable. And the human repair contractor was there, and apparently had the kind of hands that could help. The armor had recognized those hands. And 430 years later, the armor had recognized mine. I read Kavan's message 3 times. Then I sat quietly for a while, in the Harriet's cabin, with the stars outside the viewport, and the engine's familiar sound in the deck plates, and the scanner data from the old repair seam still on my console screen. I thought about the chain of it, the things that had to be true for me to have been in that chamber. The woman 4 centuries ago who had been in the right place at the wrong time, and had fixed something she had no permission to fix. The armor keeping the memory of her hands in its living thread for 400 years. The scanner modification I had made to read Karath alloys, which was what had taken me to the right debris fields, which was what had put me in the path of the thermal signature. The decision to board, which I had made in the same way she had probably made the decision to take the job, because there was something that needed fixing, and she was there, and she had enough of the right kind of knowledge to start. The chain was long, and most of it was made of coincidence and circumstances and individual small choices that nobody had intended to connect to each other. But the chain had connected, and at both ends of it were human hands on living iron, doing something that had not been done before, leaving something behind. I wrote back to Kavan. I said, "The border station log is the last piece. You found it. That is more than I expected anyone to find, and more than she probably expected anyone to find. Whatever her name was, the armor kept what she left. That is better than a name in a record." Kavan wrote back the same day. She said, "I agree. I am going to note in my report to the Queen that the name is likely unrecoverable, but the work is documented. She fixed the armor, and the armor held, and now we know it held. That is the important part. She sent the final message 3 days later. Not a long one. She said, "The Queen would like to speak with you when you have time. She has read my report. She has some things to say that she prefers to say herself." I set a time. The call came through on the priority channel, voice only, no transmission delay that I could detect, which meant the Dominion was routing it through something faster than standard communication infrastructure. Sarava's voice was exactly as I remembered it. The weight it carried, the way it filled a space without requiring volume. "Cavan sent me the full report," she said. "Yes," I said. "The border station log, the captain's letter, the memoir passage." She paused. "She was real." "She was real," I said. "The armor held her for 400 years," she said. "Not her name, not her record. The particular quality of her hands, the specific way her biology interacted with the living thread." She was quiet for a moment. "I have been wearing this armor for 9 years. I have felt echoes I did not have contexts for. I think now I may know what some of those echoes were." "The shape of what someone felt," I said. "That is what you told me echoes were." "Yes," she said. "The shape of what someone felt when they did something they were not supposed to be doing, in a place they were not supposed to be, and the armor held together because of it, and they went away without leaving a name." She paused. "I think the echo I could not place was something like confidence. A very specific kind. The confidence of someone who has already decided that the problem is solvable, and the only remaining question is the method." "That sounds familiar," I said. "I know," she said. "It is why I recognized it when you walked in." I sat with that for a moment. "She never knew," I said, "about what she left in the armor. She fixed it, and she left, and she never knew the armor had kept her." "No," Sarava said. "She did not know." "Does that matter?" I said. She was quiet for a long time, longer than most pauses in most conversations. "No," she said. "I do not think it does. The work was good work whether or not she knew what it would become. The armor was whole, because of her, whether or not the Dominion's records acknowledged it. The thread carried her forward, because the thread decided to, not because she asked it to." A pause. "She did a real thing. Real things do not require acknowledgement to stay real." "No," I said, "they do not. The Guild has completed their initial examination of the third plate group," she said. "They are drafting a new framework for living iron research, based on the observations from this armor. Sev has informed me that she is proposing to name the observed phenomenon." "What is she naming it?" I said. "She has not decided," Sarava said. "She said she wants to discuss it with you first. She feels the name should reflect both the historical repair and the current intervention." I thought about that. "Tell her she does not need my input on the name," I said. "She is the expert. She should name it for what it actually is." "She will want to argue with you about that," Sarava said. "I am warning you in advance." "She can argue with me," I said. "She is probably right that she is right, and I am right, that she does not need my approval to proceed." Sarava made the sound, the one that had taken me a while to learn, and that I still did not have a full translation for. In the context I had now, with months more of knowing her, I was more confident in my interpretation. "The copper in the bonding layer," she said. "I can feel it when I run the armor's full diagnostic. The Guild says it is performing better than the original material in that location. That whatever properties the living thread found in the copper were properties the bonding layer needed, that the original material did not fully provide." "The armor kept what worked," I said. "Yes," she said. "The armor kept what worked." A pause. "I am going to do the same." "All right," I said. "The informal arrangement stands," she said. "The marker is registered. If I need specific hands for a specific problem, I will contact you. And I will answer," I said. "How is the clamp mount?" she said. "Fixed on day 1, I said. "As I told you at the time." "I know," she said. "I like asking. It confirms you do what you say you will do when you say you will do it." "I always do that," I said. "I know," she said. "That is also why I keep asking." The call ended. I sat at the Harriet's console for a while. Outside the viewport, the outer corridor ran in both directions, dark and long and full of ships going places, and things that needed fixing, and individual people making individual decisions in the spaces between what was officially permitted and what was practically necessary. My scanner was running its passive survey, picking up the ambient background of the corridor. Nothing significant. Debris, a few ship signatures at distance, the routine background of a lived-in stretch of space. I pulled up the deep structure scan of the old repair seam on the console screen. The handprint was still there. It would always be there. 400 years of being there had not changed it, and 400 more were not going to change it either, because the armor had decided to keep it, and the armor did not change its mind about things it had decided to keep. I thought about her one last time. The woman with the unusual hands for a small creature, working quickly without instruction, charging a reasonable rate, leaving before anyone could ask her name or record it, fixing something she had no permission to fix, because it was there, and needed fixing, and she was there, and had enough of the right kind of knowledge to start. She had not known what she was leaving behind. She had done the work and gone home, or wherever home was for someone working the outer margin routes in the long silence, someone living the same kind of life I lived, moving between problems, carrying tools, doing good work in spaces that other people's official structures had decided were someone else's responsibility. But the armor had known. The living thread had recognized something in the quality of her contact, something specific and real, and had held it, had carried it forward through 4 centuries of other queens, and other battles and other repairs, waiting, until another set of hands with the same quality came along. I was glad to have been those hands. I closed the scan file. I pulled up the manifest for the next stop on my route, and started reviewing the jobs scheduled there. An environmental system overhaul on a courier ship, whose owner I had not worked with before. A sensor calibration on a cargo hauler that I had worked on twice before, and whose systems I knew well enough to have an estimate already forming in my head. A hull integrity assessment on a station tender that had taken debris impact 2 weeks ago, and whose station manager wanted a full report before authorizing repairs. Good work, useful work, the kind that keeps things running that would otherwise stop. The Harriet's engine ran in its familiar rhythm, even and consistent, the sound of a ship doing exactly what it was built to do. The slight irregularity in the idle was still there, the one I had decided to leave alone because it was not causing a problem, and fixing it would require pulling the main drive manifold, still not causing a problem, still there. The stars held their positions outside the viewport, ancient and indifferent, and exactly where they had always been. I set the heading and let the autopilot take over, and went to make coffee from the machine older than my certification, and drank it standing at the galley counter, thinking about nothing in particular, except the next job, and the job after that, and the steady, ordinary, necessary work of keeping things running. At the bottom of my tool bag, wrapped in its cloth at the bottom where it lived, my grandmother's wrench kept its weight and its silence, the way it always had, useful for angles nothing else could reach. I rinsed my cup and put it back in its place. The Harriet hummed,